The samurais were the military elite of medieval and early modern Japan. But how did they really look like? Maybe something like this. Sure, when modern Asian actors play the roles of samurais, they will look like this. However, I would like to introduce to you Okubo Toshimichi, who was a hereditary samurai from Satsuma. But let's start from the very beginning. Long before the arrival of the Asian race on the Japanese islands, the local inhabitants were Caucasian people, the Ainu people. Their very outfits point to the fact that they also belonged to the culture of the survivors. However, they are one of the first waves that arrived. Their worldview and philosophy is also fully consistent with those of the survivors, as represented, for example, by the Vedic literature. It's interesting that the Ainu women actually liked to tattoo their faces. This is a Portuguese world map dated at the year 1623, and the maker considered Japan to be a Christian country. That is why he placed this big cross over the Japanese islands. And it's not the only one. The island, which is nowadays called Hokkaido, had a different name in the Middle Ages, and the name was Ieyasu, which sounds like Jesus, the Slavic name of Jesus Christ. And to make it even more clear, they have put a Christian cross on it. This is yet another map showing the same island, and here it is written as Yesu, even closer to Jesus, Jesus Christ. Of course, the official Japanese history has undergone parasitic corrections, but still, few forgotten facts here and there may help us reconstruct the real scenario. Exactly when in Russia the last strongholds of the survivors were destroyed, at that time in Japan appears a ruler called Tokugawa Ieyasu. It is possible that his name points towards the fact that he was a Christian, Ieyasu, Jesus, Jesus. When Tokugawa Ieyasu starts ruling, Japan all of a sudden decides to sever all connections with the external world and remain a completely closed country. Most likely, the defeated survivors from Siberia sought refuge with their brothers in Japan. According to the official history of Japan, at that time, the country was greatly influenced by the so-called Rusui, which sounds very similar to Rusi, which means in Slavic languages Russians. However, they conveniently escaped giving details where did those Rusuis come from. The center of the Rusuis was Edo, and we see some buildings there that really don't fit in the Japanese style architecture and building because traditionally the Asian population of Japan used to construct their buildings out of wood, not stone. The choice of material is not the most important. Most importantly, we see how in the history of building in Japan, all of a sudden, without any prior evolution, we see full-fledged, elegant, polygonal, megalithic stone masonry, which is a distinct signature sign, so to say, of the survivors. That's how they built their buildings all over the world. This is St. Petersburg, Russia. This is Saxe-Herman in Peru. This is Norba, Italy. Polygonal megalithic masonry is a very peculiar building style where each stone is unique, of unique shape, and yet fits all the neighboring stones with amazing accuracy. The chance that this building style has evolved independently at various locations all around the world is very close to zero. On the last three photos, a part of the megalithic wall is shown where it has been destroyed and subsequently renovated in a very poor fashion, with mud in between. But these photos are important because on them we can see how the stones look inside the wall and how they perfectly fit each other in a very complex and curved surface. Another example, this enormous megalithic stone is part of the Osaka castle. This is how contemporary artists depicted the kings of Japan, the shoguns. They were the rulers of the samurais and continued their reign until the middle of 19th century when the European Reformationists successfully destroyed a lot of the strongholds of the survivors, and since their intention was to completely even erase the memory of them, they turned their attention to the closed Japan, the isolated Japan. Wipeout of the samurais is presented in the Scarigir version of history as the Meiji Restoration, and that is supposed to be a return towards some previously forgotten ideologies, values, and political structures. Very little information, very little importance is given to this moment in history when they teach it in the Japanese schools. They go through it very briefly and superficially, and it is presented to be some sort of local for Japan event. And maybe there will be some very vague hint towards the European ships that appeared on the shore of Japan at that time. Indeed, in some Japanese textbooks, they are presented as merchants' ships that were helping by giving donations of rice. Rice sounds so innocent, but there were other things besides the rice. But fortunately, not all true history has been erased, and we hear a completely different story from a book called Black Ships of Japan. Quite an ambiguous title by itself. So what we read there is that Commodore Perry arrived in Edo in 1853 and brought a letter from Fillmore, the President of the United States, demanding in absolutely straightforward language to put an end to the isolation of Japan and open it to the rest of the world in every way. Perry returned next year and demanded this to be done immediately. The people of Japan did not wish to step back from their way of life, from their tradition and ideology. However, the story continues, they changed their mind after they encountered the English military force. Well, as a result of this military encounter, the samurais were defeated and the Japanese society was forced to accept the Western way of life and to reform their traditional views. The last group of samurais was killed in 1868 in the town of Aizu Wakamatsu in northern Japan. Nowadays, in the castle of Aizu Wakamatsu, there is a museum. In this museum, there is a huge piece of art depicting the very last moments of the samurais. And of course, they are shown as belonging to the Asian race, because this is just a modern piece of art. However, very few people pay attention to a small photo that stands besides this huge modern piece of art. This gentleman, one of the last survivors or samurais, took part in some of the last battles of the samurais at a very young age and survived after that, and he lived long enough to be alive when photography was available, and so this photo of his was taken and is now kept in the museum of Ieyasu Wakamatsu. You can see that he had European features. He was a Caucasian person. It is quite remarkable that we even have a photograph of a person, one of the last people alive who belonged to a society that kept the memory, the history of the survivors, and valued and understood the spiritual teachings of the survivors, most importantly. If you visit the valley of Aizu even nowadays, you will meet on the street a lot of local people with purely European faces. But of course, most of them would be a mixture between Asians and Caucasians. As I was researching this topic, I found Japanese people posting on forums questions why I look European, why I'm Caucasian, I'm Japanese, and yet I do not look like Japanese. I noticed the questions, I didn't see any answers in the forums. We also see the crescent symbol on the head of the samurais, which was one of the main symbols of the empire and the culture of the survivors. And this is an authentic, genuine samurai outfit. The crescent symbol can be found also all over the garments, the outfits. Actually, I will come back to this topic later on when I review the symbols of the empire of the survivors all over the world. The Tsurugacho Castle in Aizu Wakamatsu is currently a museum, and over there is depiction of the very last moments of the samurais, how they commit seppuku and kill themselves when the invaders are at their doorstep. Anatoly Fomenko shares his experience in this museum at this very scene. He was accompanied by his colleagues, Japanese colleague, historians, who were viewing together with him. But surprise, surprise, who was opening the door to enter the room where the last samurais were committing suicide? It was a completely Caucasian person with a Napoleon-like outfit. Fomenko asked his Japanese colleagues, who is this person? In reply, they just tried to make the appearance that they do not understand the speech of foreigners, although they understood very well. Even a beginner in English will understand the question, who is this? The true face of the so-called local Meiji restoration in Japan, the very truth is that some of the last survivors were most brutally and barbarically killed by Europeans. These Europeans had the blood of the survivors also flowing in their veins, but they were zombified by the fraudulent parasitic propaganda that packages cruelty, inhumane cruelty, in calling it patriotism and other names that have nothing to do with the essence. There is zero patriotism in going halfway across the globe to brutally murder peaceful people. All of the important buildings in Tokyo and some other cities of this period are of course in survivor style, which is antique style. I don't call it neoclassical because the period that we call antiquity happened 1000 years after the official time that we know about. And that makes it actually quite near to us in the timeline. All the fabulous antique kingdoms that we have heard about from the Scaliger version of history were indeed cultures created by the survivors. That's why they bear same cultural style. In terms of buildings, the styles that we are used to calling Greco-Roman and Neoclassical are indeed one single coherent style that the survivors spread all over the world, and it was them only who gave us what we call civilization. They were the bedrock of our civilization and not the Greco-Romans as we have been conditioned into accepting without demanding confirmation. These buildings look very awkward on the background of the official history of Japan. Let's hypothetically assume that they were built after Japan opened for the world. But how could they find place for these buildings? Just the full city centers of the main cities are in this style. What did the Japanese, who are very famous of keeping their tradition, just demolish all of their most important traditional buildings in the center of the city to build something in a completely new for them style? This is a large-scale operation that I cannot believe in. And second of all, if it would have happened, it would have been recorded in their history, but there is nothing, no such demolition. The problem of overbuilding is not new to Japan. It's not just a modern problem. What you see now on the screen is the situation with overbuilding at the time when Japan opened for the world. Just imagine what kind of a massive demolition must have happened in order to open the space for all these European style buildings. That is, in my hypothetical scenario, that the official version of the history of Japan is correct. But in the scenario of the new chronology, all these buildings fit perfectly well because they were built by the Christian Caucasian survivors, descendants of the survivors, not exactly survivors, but people who kept the memory of them and their history and their values. And I will revisit the topic of Japan not only when I review the symbols of the empire all over the world, but also when I review the star forts and the special standard city planning that the survivors always took with them wherever they went all over the globe.